The night Edmund Holt died, the temperature in Beaverhead County dropped to 31 below zero. Not the kind of cold that inconveniences a man, the kind that makes decisions for him. Clara heard the north wall go at 2 in the morning. Not a crack, not a groan, a sound like a rifle shot fired inside the barn itself, sharp and final the way wood sounds when it has been holding against something too long and simply cannot hold anymore. She was already awake. She had been lying in the dark for the better part of an hour, listening to the wind work at the eaves of the cabin, listening to the particular pitch that told her this storm was different from the storms that had come before it. She sat up, reached for her coat on the hook beside the bed. Edmund was already moving. He had heard it too, that rifle shot crack, and he was pulling on his boots before she had her second arm through her sleeve. He moved the way he always moved when the land demanded something of him, with a kind of urgent certainty, as though speed itself were a form of competence, as though a man who hesitated in a crisis was a man who had already failed it. She stood. She was going with him. That was not a question in her mind. He looked at her once in the dim light of the lamp he had already lit, and said what he said in the voice he used when a thing was settled. "This isn't your work tonight. Stay inside." She stayed inside. She would spend the next 16 months asking herself what would have happened if she had not. Clara Holt was 41 years old in the winter of 1882, and she had lived in Beaverhead County, Montana territory for long enough to understand that this land did not care about a person's intentions. It cared about outcomes. It measured a rancher not by how hard he worked, but by how many animals walked out of a given winter alive, how much feed remained in the bin when the last frost finally broke, how much money was left in the ledger after a season that had taken everything it could take. The land kept its own accounting, and it did not forgive arithmetic that did not add up. She and Edmund had come west in the spring of 1882 with 2 horses, a small herd of milk cows, and 11 sheep purchased on credit from a dealer up in Bannock. They had come with the particular optimism of people who have spent their whole lives in one place and convinced themselves that a different place will make them different people. Edmund had grown up in Ohio on a farm his father had built, and his grandfather had cleared in a county where the winters were cold enough to be serious, but not cold enough to be fatal. He had learned to ranch the way his father had learned, by watching, by copying, by absorbing the accumulated habits of men who had done the same things in the same ways for so long that those ways had stopped being choices and started being facts. Build a timber frame barn. Chink the gaps with mud and moss. Stack hay bales against the north wall for insulation. Pray the livestock survived until April. That was the method. That was the entire method. And every rancher in the valley followed it generation after generation, as though it had been handed down from some higher authority, rather than simply copied from the last man who had copied it from the man before him. Edmund believed in it the way he believed in most things completely, without reservation, with a confidence that Clara had learned early in their marriage was not stubbornness exactly, but something close to it. A refusal to allow the possibility that a thing could be both familiar and wrong. He kept his barn square and tight. He stacked his wood higher than any neighbor's by the first frost. He repaired every crack, every loose board, every gap in the chinking before the serious cold arrived. And he stood back and looked at what he had built with the quiet pride of a man who believed that visible effort was its own kind of proof. Clara did not share that belief. She had never said so directly. That was not how their marriage worked, and she was honest enough with herself to understand that her silence on the subject had been a form of agreement, however reluctant. But she had watched their first Montana winter with a kind of careful attention that Edmund did not bring to the same observations, and what she had noticed troubled her in ways she could not yet fully articulate. Every rancher in the valley lost animals in winter. Not a few. Not the unlucky ones, not the ranchers who had made obvious errors or cut corners in obvious places. All of them. The careful ones and the careless ones. The ones who had been here 20 years and the ones who had arrived last spring. The losses varied in scale, but not in direction. They always went the same way, always pointed toward the same conclusion, and yet no one in the valley spoke of those losses as though they indicated a problem with the method. They spoke of them the way they spoke of weather as an unavoidable cost, a tax levied by the mountains for the privilege of living among them. Clara thought they were wrong about that. She was not yet sure what the right answer looked like, but she was increasingly certain that the accepted answer was not it. She did not say this to Edmund, and then the north wall split on the night of December 19th, 1882, and Edmund went out into 31 below zero with a lantern and a hammer, and Clara stayed inside because he had asked her to, and by dawn, he was dead. She found him at first light frozen against the splintered timber, the hammer still in his right hand, the board he had been trying to nail across the gap half attached and already rimed with frost. He had not died of cold alone. The doctor who rode out from Dillon 3 days later would call it pneumonia setting in fast on a body already broken by exposure. But Clara understood something the diagnosis could not capture. Edmund had died defending a wall that should never have needed defending in the first place. He had died for the idea that a visible repair was worth more than a solution that simply worked. He had died because he had built his barn the way every man in the valley built his barn, and because it had failed him the way it failed all of them every winter, year after year, and because he had believed, genuinely believed, to the last moment of his life that the failure was his to overcome rather than the methods to answer for. She buried him on a hillside above the cabin. The ground was so hard the men who helped her dig had to build a fire over the spot first just to soften the topsoil. She wore her only formal dress, black wool borrowed gloves 2 sizes too large because her own had worn through at the knuckles. She stood at the graveside 41 years old. No children, no brothers, within 400 miles. and she looked at the mound of frozen earth and felt something settle inside her that was not grief exactly, or not only grief. It was something harder than grief, something with edges. A determination that what had happened to Edmund would not be the final lesson this land had to teach her. The winter that followed his death was the worst 3 months of Clara Holt's life, and she had not lived an easy life. She managed alone because she had no other choice, and because the animals in the barn did not understand that she was grieving, did not adjust their needs to her capacity, did not pause their slow deterioration to allow her time to recover. 3 sheep died in the first week of January. 1 calf born in a cold snap nobody predicted lived only 6 hours. Her 2 horses, a steady gray mare named Patience, and a younger bay she had never quite gotten around to naming, properly dropped weight so severely by February that she could count their ribs through coats that should have been thick with winter growth. She burned through her entire woodpile before the worst of the cold had passed. And she spent 3 days in late February doing fence mending work for a neighbor just to keep her own cabin fire lit through the final weeks of March. The barn Edmund had built, the barn he had died defending, was killing her animals as efficiently as the open range would have. She understood this with a clarity that frightened her, because it meant the thing Edmund had believed in, the thing he had given his life for, had never actually worked. It had only looked like it worked because everyone around them failed in the same way, and shared failure had a particular talent for disguising itself as normal. She sat with her ledger in the last week of February, in the small, cold hours before dawn, going over numbers that told her nothing but bad news. And she let herself think the thought she had been circling for weeks, without quite allowing herself to land on it directly. The barn was the problem. Not this barn specifically, not Edmund's barn or any individual rancher's barn. The barn itself, the timber frame, the mud-chinked gaps, the hay bales stacked against the north wall, the entire method that every man in the valley had inherited without examination and defended without evidence. The method was the problem. The method had been the problem all along, and nobody had noticed because they were all failing in exactly the same direction. She needed a different answer. She did not yet know what it looked like. What came to her sitting at that table in the dark with the wind pressing at the cabin walls was not an idea. It was a memory, a specific sensory memory from October of 1881, 14 months earlier, a memory she had not thought about since the moment it formed. She had been driving her small flock of sheep back from a high pasture when an early autumn hailstorm broke without warning. The sky had gone the color of a bruise within 10 minutes, and she had pushed the sheep into the mouth of a limestone cave set into a ridge a quarter-mile from the cabin, purely to escape the hail, expecting the inside to feel as raw and exposed as the rock face suggested. Instead, she had stood just inside the entrance hail, rattling against stone outside the noise of the storm, immediate and violent, and felt something close to disbelief at how still the air held around her. Not warm exactly, but still. Completely unusually still. The temperature inside that hollow in the rock had barely registered the chaos happening 6 feet from where she stood. She had not thought about it again. The memory had lodged itself somewhere beneath conscious thought, the way useful things sometimes do, waiting for a need sharp enough to call it back. The need had arrived. Clara Holt was not a woman who moved slowly once she had made up her mind about something. She had learned across 4 decades of living that hesitation was its own kind of decision, and she had no interest in making it. By April of 1883, 3 months after Edmund's death, and 1 month after the last frost broke, she was carrying tools to the limestone ridge. A borrowed pickaxe, a shovel worn thin at the blade, a hand drill inherited from Edmund's tool chest, the handle still dark with the oil of his palm. She began the work of turning a natural hollow in the rock into something deliberate, something engineered to answer the specific problem that had been killing livestock in this valley since the first settler built the first barn and stacked the first bale of hay against the first north wall and called the result good enough. The cave opening faced south toward the weak winter sun. The natural cavity ran roughly 12 feet deep, 20 feet wide, 9 feet tall at the mouth. Local hunters used it occasionally as brief shelter, ducking in for an hour before moving on, never imagining it as anything more permanent than a temporary refuge. Clara imagined it as something permanent. She imagined it as the thing that would make the difference between what had happened to Edmund and what she intended to happen to herself. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. There was no one to tell, and even if there had been, she understood already that the telling would invite exactly the kind of conversation she did not have time for. She had perhaps 6 months before the cold returned in earnest. She intended to spend those months working, not explaining. By May, neighbors riding past on the county road had started noticing the activity. A woman disappearing into a hole in a limestone ridge carrying lumber and rope. Slowing their horses. Watching. Saying nothing yet, but watching with the particular quality of attention that precedes judgment. By June, the judgment had found its voice. Walter Crane was the most respected livestock man in Beaverhead County, and he had earned that respect the way most men earned it in Montana Territory, through accumulation. 12 years of hard-won knowledge about this specific land, these specific winters, the particular way cold moved down off the divide and settled into the basin in the deep months. He had buried 2 brothers-in-law to weather and 1 ranch hand to a stampede, and he had built his reputation on the kind of plain-spoken certainty that men in this valley trusted because it had been tested against real conditions and had not broken. He was 54 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been shaped by decades of wind into something angular and uncompromising. He wore a heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin, a flat-brimmed hat, pulled low leather gloves, cracked white at the knuckles from years of cold rope work. He was not a cruel man. He was not even in his own understanding an unfair one. He was a man who had earned the right to speak plainly, and he exercised that right without apology. He rode out to Clara's homestead on a morning in June with two other ranchers behind him, and he stood at the cave entrance, and he looked inside for a long moment, and then he turned back toward her with his jaw set in a way that settled the question of what he intended to say before he said it. This is the most dangerous thing I have seen a settler attempt in 12 years on this land. He said it loud enough that the words carried. He said it the way a man says something he wants to become part of the record. Samuel Pratt was there too that morning. Pratt had constructed nearly every barn standing within 15 miles of Dillon, 60 years old, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent 3 decades learning what wood and stone did under pressure. He stood at the entrance with his arms crossed, surveying Clara's work with professional authority. "That cave will sweat," he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man delivering a diagnosis. "Moisture will condense on those walls the moment warm breath meets cold rock. It will soak your hay rot. Your feed breeds sickness in every animal you put inside. You will lose everything you have by January, and you will have no one to blame but yourself for not listening to men who know better." Clara listened to all of it. She stood with her hands at her sides and her face composed, and she let Walter Crane and Samuel Pratt say what they had come to say. And when they were finished, she did not argue. She did not explain her reasoning or describe her measurements or attempt to walk them through the logic she had been building in her own mind since February. She understood already that argument was not available to her in the way it might have been available to a man standing in her position. A man who pushed back against Walter Crane in front of witnesses would be seen as standing his ground. A woman who did the same thing would be seen as confirmation that she had lost her grip on reason. The asymmetry was not something she could argue her way around. It was simply the terrain she was working in, and she had learned to work in difficult terrain. What she did not yet know, what she would not learn until much later in a conversation that would reframe everything she thought she understood about Walter Crane's opposition, was that his certainty carried a weight entirely different from the professional confidence it appeared to be. 3 years earlier, in the Bitterroot country of Idaho, Walter's younger brother Bobby had been caught out in a sudden storm while inspecting a stretch of fence line on a mining claim he had invested in. Bobby Crane was 29 years old, sensible, experienced in mountain weather. When the storm came down fast and hard, he did what any sensible man in his position would do. He found shelter. A mining cut in the rock face, dry inside, deep enough to block the wind, the obvious choice. He crawled in and waited for the storm to pass. The snow loaded on the rock above the entrance through the night. The roof came down while he slept. It took Walter 3 days of digging once the storm cleared enough to let him through to reach his brother's body. Walter Crane had not set foot inside an enclosed stone space since that day. He had never spoken of the reason. Not to his wife, not to the men who worked his land, not to anyone in Beaverhead County who had known him for 12 years and believed they understood him. His opposition to Clara's cave was not in his own mind about gender. It was not about expertise or tradition or the accumulated wisdom of a cattleman who had earned his standing. It was about a hole in the rock and the sound of something giving way in the dark, and a brother he had pulled out of the earth with his own hands 3 days too late. He did not know that he was carrying this into the argument. That was the particular nature of the wound. It did not announce itself as what it was. It dressed itself in competence and experience and plain-spoken certainty, and it sounded to everyone who heard it exactly like authority. Clara heard it as authority. She had no reason to hear it as anything else. She turned back toward the cave entrance after Walter and Samuel Pratt and the others had said their piece and prepared to leave, and she picked up the pickaxe she had set down to listen, and she went back to work. Her hands on the handle were steady. She had been frightened, she would admit later, but not by Walter Crane. Not by Samuel Pratt's professional condemnation or the quiet nods of the men standing behind them. What frightened her, if she was being honest with herself, was something she had been sitting with since February, since the night she had made up her mind and committed herself to this course. She had 20 minutes of standing in a cave during a hailstorm in October of 1881. And 14 months of watching her animals die in a barn built according to the accepted method, and a ledger full of numbers that pointed unambiguously in one direction. She had logic. She had observation. She had a theory that she believed was sound. What she did not have was proof. The proof would come, or it would not come in the months ahead. Walter Crane would come back in the spring as she had told him to. Samuel Pratt would come back. The entire county would be watching, and they would be watching with the particular hungry attention of people who expected to be proven right. She could not afford to give them the satisfaction. She chipped another inch of limestone from the cave wall and carried the rubble out in a bucket and went back for more. The summer deepened around her as she worked. The valley turned green and then gold, and the days grew long, and then began to shorten again, and the air carried the first edge of autumn before she had finished what she had set out to build. She worked with a methodical precision that she did not allow herself to rush, even when the calendar pressed against her, and the light came later each morning, and she lay awake calculating how many working hours she had left before the cold returned. She widened the cave entrance to exactly 16 feet. Not 15. Not 17, 16, because she had measured the ceiling load and understood without having the engineering language to name what she understood, that 16 was the widest she could make it while leaving enough supporting rock at the threshold to hold the ceiling through a heavy snow load. She carved a shallow drainage trench along the cave floor, sloped just enough to channel meltwater and seepage away from where the animals would stand. She tested it with buckets of water, watching where it pulled, adjusting the grade until nothing collected where it shouldn't. She built a low stone wall 18 inches high just inside the entrance. Cold air sinks. It settles into low ground and pools in hollows. She had observed this on her own land for 2 years, without anyone teaching it to her. the way frost came first to the low spots, the way ice formed in the places where cold air gathered and pooled. If she gave that cold air a small wall to climb, much of it would simply slide back down and out the way it came, leaving the warmer air above the barrier undisturbed. She stacked hay at the rear of the cave and carved anchor points for her animals directly into the stone walls with the hand drill from Edmund's chest, working an inch of rock at a time, using sheer persistence to do what better tools would have done more quickly. She chiseled 2 ventilation shafts near the cave ceiling, angling them upward toward natural fissures she had traced by candlelight on her hands and knees, following faint drafts of outside air until she found where they surfaced. She built a double door system at the entrance, an outer door of rough planking hung on iron hinges scavenged from a collapsed line shack 2 miles north, and an inner door of canvas and wool layered over a simple wooden frame. Light enough to push through easily, thick enough to trap whatever warmth the interior held. Total material cost beyond her own labor $40 spent mostly on hinges and nails and canvas charged on credit at the general store in Dillon. Total labor, 4 months of work that left new calluses in places her hands had never had them before, and an ache in her back that she had learned to sleep through by August. By October of 1883, the cave stable was finished. She stood at the entrance on the morning she completed the final door and looked at what she had built, and she allowed herself one moment of something close to satisfaction before the doubt settled back in around it. The doubt was not weakness. The doubt was appropriate. She had built something that had never been built before in this valley, based on reasoning she had developed alone without confirmation from anyone who knew more than she did, without a single precedent she could point to and say, "This has been done and it worked." Everything now depended on winter, and winter in Montana Territory always had the last word. Walter Crane came back in November, as she had known he would with Harlan Dunbar and one other rancher, riding out to her homestead on a cold Saturday morning when the first serious frosts had already put a crust on the ground, and the sky had the flat gray color that preceded real snow. He dismounted. He walked to the cave entrance. He looked inside for a long moment at the hay stacked in the rear, at the horses already tethered to their stone anchor points, at the low wall just inside the threshold, at the ventilation shafts she had cut near the ceiling. He turned back to her with his jaw set. "Eleanor," he said, and then caught himself. "Clara, I'm saying this in front of witnesses because I want it on record. What you are doing here is reckless beyond anything I have seen attempted in this valley. You are going to kill your stock, and when you do, people are going to remember that we tried to stop you, and you would not listen." Harlan Dunbar nodded before Clara could respond. "This isn't a stable," he said, his voice carrying the flat inflection of a man stating the obvious. "It's a trap. Animals need daylight. They need fresh air moving around them. You've got them pinned in there with no way out if something goes wrong." "What happens when that ceiling cracks?" Walter continued, his voice rising slightly, gathering the momentum of a man who had rehearsed this. "What happens when the spring melt floods that trench you dug? What happens when your ventilation shafts freeze shut? Your animals suffocate on their own breath while you're asleep in your cabin a quarter-mile away. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice dropped into something quieter than anger. "You're not a rancher," he said. "You're a woman trying to do a man's job with a fool's method. If you had any sense left in you, you would sell this place, move into town, and let someone who actually understands livestock take over before you embarrass yourself any further than you already have." One of the ranchers standing behind him muttered something low enough that he likely thought she couldn't hear it clearly. She heard it clearly. Clara looked at him, then at Walter, then back at the cave entrance where her horses stood quietly tethered in the dim interior, unaware of the argument being conducted on their behalf. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the heat the men around her seemed to expect. "I have done the math on the feed. I have tested the airflow with my own hands through every kind of weather this summer threw at me. I have measured the temperature against a thermometer I bought with my own money, and I have made my decision based on what I observed, not on what anyone here believes should be true." She looked at Walter Crane directly. "Ride back out here in the spring. See for yourselves who turned out to be right." Walter shook his head slowly. "We will," he said, "and I will be the first man in this valley to say I told you so." They mounted their horses and rode off without further argument. Clara turned back to the cave. Her hands were steady. She had learned across the 16 months since Edmund's death that steadiness was the only response available to her that men like Walter Crane could neither mock nor dismiss. She did not feel steady inside. She had not felt entirely steady since the morning she had found Edmund frozen against the wall he had died defending. But steadiness, she had discovered, did not require feeling. It only required that you keep your hands from shaking while other people were watching. She picked up a hay bale and carried it to the rear of the cave and set it down in its place. Then she went back for another. The cold was coming. She could feel it in the quality of the air, in the way the light fell across the valley, in the particular stillness that settled over the land in the hours before a serious frost. She had 6 weeks, perhaps less, before the first real test of everything she had built would begin. 6 weeks. And then the winter would say what it had to say, and no amount of argument from Walter Crane or Samuel Pratt or anyone else in Beaverhead County would change the verdict. Clara Holt had never been more afraid in her life. She did not show it. She went back into the cave and kept working the way she had kept working since February, since the night she sat with her ledger and her losses, and the memory of a stillness inside a rock that had waited 14 months for her to be desperate enough to take it seriously. The stone around her held its temperature patient and indifferent, exactly as it had held it for 10,000 years before she arrived, and exactly as it would hold it for 10,000 years after she was gone. It did not need her to believe in it. It simply needed her to stop arguing long enough to let it do what it had always done. The first week of November brought a cold that felt like a rehearsal. Not the real thing yet. Just a reminder from the land that it had not forgotten what it was capable of. That the relative gentleness of October had been courtesy rather than mercy. And that courtesy in Montana territory had a short season. The temperature dropped into the single digits at night and climbed back to the low 20s during the day. and the ranchers across Beaverhead County fell into the familiar rhythms of early winter preparation, with the practiced efficiency of people who had done the same things in the same order for so many years that the preparation itself had become a kind of comfort. Break the ice on the water troughs each morning. Haul extra feed against the animals' rising hunger. Check the barn walls for new cracks the cold had opened overnight. Stack additional wood against the cabin wall. Count what remained. Calculate how much winter was left. Repeat. Clara Holt's routine looked entirely different from anyone else's in the county. She checked her animals twice daily, morning and evening, regardless of weather. She hauled water once each morning from the spring near the cabin water that stayed liquid through the full day inside the cave's steady interior, never requiring the second freezing trip that consumed hours of every other rancher's afternoon. She fed from the stored hay at the rear of the cave, measuring portions with a precision born of genuine fear that she might miscalculate and run short before spring arrived. She hung a simple mercury thermometer from a wooden support beam near the entrance and recorded its reading at each visit in the same ledger that had recorded Edmund's death, her first winter's losses, and every decision she had made in the months between. 46 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning, 48 in the evening. Outside, the air carried a cold that turned exposed skin numb within minutes. Inside the cave, her horses stood calm and dry, their breath barely condensing into visible clouds in the stable interior air. A detail she noticed on the third morning of November and recorded with something close to wonder, because she had genuinely not known until she saw it for herself. Whether her calculations would hold against the full force of a Montana winter still building toward its worst. The breath of her animals barely fogged. That was the first number, the first piece of evidence, small, observable, unambiguous. She wrote it down and went back to work. The mockery in the county had reached its full volume by mid-November, carried on the particular current that moved through small communities where every homestead sat within a day's ride of every other. Clara's cave stable had become the standing joke of the Dillon General Store, the kind of story men told over coffee with knowing smiles. The kind of gossip that moved through church gatherings with the velocity of something people needed to tell, because telling it confirmed something they already believed. The widow Holt had finally cracked. That was the consensus. The isolation, the grief, the weight of a homestead that had always been too much for one woman alone had finally bent something essential in her judgment. And the cave was the evidence of the bending. Men who had watched her work through the summer without comment found themselves retroactively concerned, as though the scale of her effort now struck them not as determination, but as the particular relentlessness of a person who had lost their grip on reason. Ruth Calloway was one of the few who did not say this aloud. Ruth lived 2 miles east with her husband Silas, a quiet rancher who said little but listened carefully and held his opinions in the deep places where they could not easily be read. Ruth had watched Clara's progress through the summer, with a curiosity she rarely voiced, partly because Silas held views on the matter close to Walter Crane's own, partly because she had learned across 11 years of marriage which arguments were worth the cost of having at her own kitchen table. She had ridden past the cave entrance twice that autumn, slowing her horse just long enough to take in the drainage trench, the low stone barrier, the careful stacking of hay before continuing on without stopping. She told herself the silence was caution. Some part of her knew it was something else. The thing that no one in the county said directly, but that Clara understood without being told, was that the mockery carried a sharper edge than ordinary frontier gossip, because she was not simply attempting something unconventional. She was implying, whether she intended the implication or not, that the accepted method had been wrong all along. That tradition was not the same thing as wisdom. That repeating a failing approach for 20 years did not make the approach correct, only familiar. No one in Beaverhead County enjoyed being told even indirectly that they had been doing something wrong for the entirety of their working lives. The resistance was not just to Clara's idea. It was to what her idea meant about every winter they had already lived through, every animal they had already lost, every decision they had already made with complete confidence in a method that a 41-year-old widow was now suggesting had never actually worked. Walter Crane felt this more acutely than most, though he would not have named it that way. He had lost 11 head of cattle in the previous winter alone, a loss that had cost him more than money, though it had cost him money too. He had absorbed it as he absorbed all such losses as evidence of the land's difficulty rather than his own method's failure. He had rebuilt, restocked where he could afford to, and returned in the spring to do everything the same way he had done it the year before. Because the year before, the losses had been smaller, and the year before that smaller still, and the pattern of variation was simply the pattern of weather, not the pattern of a system that was fundamentally broken. He believed this. He had built 12 years of decisions on it. He did not enjoy the feeling of watching a woman with 4 months of shovel work behind her suggest that he had been wrong for all 12 of them. It was in the middle of the 3rd week of November, 2 days after his confrontation at the cave entrance, that Clara faced a test she had not anticipated when she first sketched the design on a scrap of paper the previous spring. She woke before dawn to the smell of something wrong. Not smoke exactly. The particular flat quality of air that was not moving the way it should. She dressed in the dark and walked the 1/4 mile to the cave with a lantern. And when she stepped inside and held the flame near the first ventilation shaft, she watched it bend sideways instead of upward. The air inside the cave was circulating wrong. She spent the next hour on her hands and knees with the lantern held low, tracing the path of every draft she could detect, marking with a piece of charcoal where the air moved true and where it stalled. By the time the sky began to lighten outside the cave entrance, she understood what she was looking at. The second ventilation shaft, the one she had cut near the rear of the cave ceiling and angled upward toward a natural fissure in the ridge, was wrong by 3 or 4 degrees. Not dramatically wrong, barely perceptibly wrong. Wrong in the way that things are wrong when they look correct from one angle and reveal their error only when conditions change, and expose exactly how fragile that correctness had always been. When the wind blew from the south or the west, the shaft worked as designed, pulling warm air up and out through the fissure above. But when the wind shifted to the northwest, as it had done the previous night, and as it would do repeatedly through a Montana winter, the shaft caught that crosswind, and the airflow reversed. Instead of breathing outward, the cave breathed inward, circulating stale air back through the interior instead of replacing it with fresh air from outside. She sat back on her heels in the dim cave and looked at the problem with the particular cold clarity of a person who has just discovered that a thing they believed was finished is not finished. She had 4 days of work ahead of her to fix it. 4 days she had not budgeted. 4 days she could not get back from a calendar already short on working light. The error was not catastrophic. Her animals had breathed through it for 2 nights without apparent distress, and the ventilation failure would have been slow to cause serious harm. But slow harm was still harm, and she had built this entire structure on the premise that she had thought more carefully than the accepted method checked her work more rigorously than the men who had built timber barns for 20 years without questioning whether the timber barns were working. If she had not checked the airflow before the serious cold arrived, she might not have noticed the problem until it had already done damage she could not undo. That thought sat with her through the 4 days she spent reopening the shaft, widening and re-angling the channel with the hand drill, testing the flame at every stage, until the candle bent consistently upward, regardless of which direction the wind came from outside. She absorbed the lost time the way she had absorbed every other cost of the project, by working longer hours to make up the difference, the kind of arithmetic that left her falling into bed each night with hands too stiff to fully close. No one in the county ever learned how close her first attempt had come to repeating the same fundamental mistake she was trying to correct. She did not tell them, not because she was ashamed of the error, but because she understood that admitting it would be used against her in ways that had nothing to do with the actual significance of what had happened. She had caught the problem. She had fixed it. She had made the correction before it caused harm. That was the relevant fact. Everything else was the kind of detail that only mattered to people looking for reasons to dismiss what she was building, rather than reasons to understand it. The ventilation shafts worked correctly after that tested and retested through every wind direction November could produce. The drainage trench channeled meltwater away from the animal enclosure without pooling. The stone anchor points held firm when she tested them with a dead weight she rigged from spare lumber. The double door system stopped drafts that her hand held near the inner canvas door could not detect at all. She had built something that worked. Now she needed winter to prove it. December arrived and grew colder by the day. By the second week daytime, highs held around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, nighttime lows dropping to 15 below. The ordinary weight of a Montana winter settling across the basin with the patient inevitability of a season that had been doing this since before anyone had been here to notice it. Across the valley, the familiar losses began accumulating. Newborn calves caught by cold snaps that arrived faster than anyone predicted, their small bodies unable to hold heat against drafts. No amount of straw could stop. Feed consumption climbing as animals stood in cold barns, burning their own reserves simply to stay alive. Water hauled twice daily in buckets that grew heavier with each freezing trip, often turning to ice before the animals finished drinking. Clara hauled water once. In the third week of December, a test arrived that no one in the valley witnessed but Clara herself, and which she chose not to mention to anyone afterward, not out of secrecy, but because she had not yet decided what it meant about the limits of what she had built. One of her cows, heavy with a calf due sometime in late winter, began moving with an unfamiliar restlessness one evening, pawing at the cave floor near her tie point. In a way Clara recognized from years spent around livestock. Too early for the calf to come, 6 weeks too early, at least. But the animal's behavior had the particular quality of distress that demanded attention rather than patience. And Clara sat with her for nearly 3 hours that night by lantern light, watching for signs of real labor, running her hand along the animal's flank, feeling for the tightness that would signal something beyond ordinary discomfort. The restlessness passed by midnight. Whatever had unsettled the cow, a cramp and early contraction that resolved itself a shift in the calf's position, passed without consequence, and the animal settled back into the slow, contented breathing that Clara had come to expect from livestock, housed in that steady, stone-held warmth. Clara stayed awake long after the danger had clearly faded. She was entirely alone out here. That was not a new fact. It had been true since Edmund's death, and she had built her entire life since then around managing that fact rather than fighting it. But sitting in the cave in the deep middle of a December night, listening to her cow breathe and thinking about what would have happened if the distress had been real, she felt the weight of that aloneness in a way she did not often allow herself to feel it directly. The cave could hold its temperature against any storm the sky produced. It could not deliver a calf. It could not stop bleeding. It could not do anything beyond what her own 2 hands were capable of doing in the moment. And her hands, however capable, were the only hands available to her in the dark hours of a Montana winter night when something went wrong. She walked back to her cabin in the gray light of early morning and recorded the night's events in 3 flat lines. She did not write down the fear that had sat beside her through those 3 hours. The ledger was not built to hold fear, only outcomes. The outcome this time had been nothing at all. But she understood that nothing was not the same as safe. It was simply the absence for one night of the thing she feared most. January arrived, and the winter that had been merely difficult so far stopped pretending. On January the 9th, 1884, a blizzard rolled down out of Canada with the particular violence of a storm that has been building momentum across 1,000 miles of open country and meets no obstacle worth the name until it hits the mountains of Montana Territory. The wind came in at 40 miles an hour and brought a cold that made the previous months feel like preparation temperatures that dropped to 28 below on the first night, and then kept going, touching 31 below on the second night, while the wind drove snow sideways across the valley floor in sheets that reduced visibility to arm's length and then less. The storm settled over Beaverhead County and refused to lift for 4 days. Barn doors froze solid in their frames across the valley. Ranchers chipped and pried at hinges with numb hands just to reach animals trapped inside structures that were losing their battle against the cold with every passing hour. Livestock huddled in corners, shivering hard enough that observers later swore they could hear it. Water troughs froze solid despite twice daily breaking. Feed consumption doubled as animals burned everything they had stored, simply trying to maintain body temperature against the cold pouring through every gap that timber and mud chinking could not fully seal. Walter Crane lost 3 cattle on the first night. He lost 4 more on the second. By the morning of the 3rd day, he was walking his property at dawn, counting what remained, and the number was 11 fewer than it had been when the storm started. Clara walked the 1/4 mile from her cabin to the cave twice each day through all 4 days of the storm. Once at dawn, once in the late afternoon before the light failed completely. The walk took 20 minutes on the first day and closer to 40 on the second, when the drifts had built high enough to require a different route, and the wind was strong enough that she had to lean into it at an angle just to make forward progress. She arrived at the cave on the second evening with her face so cold she could not feel her cheekbones and her hands numb inside 2 pairs of gloves, and she pushed through the outer door and then through the inner canvas door and stood in the interior air and felt the temperature the way you feel something you have been waiting a long time to confirm. 44 degrees. She stood there for a moment without moving. The wind outside was screaming across the rock face with a sound like something being torn. Inside the cave, that sound was reduced to a distant suggestion, the way a storm sounds when you are hearing it through walls that were not built this year or last year or in any year within the span of human memory, but were simply here, had simply always been here, holding their temperature against every surface condition the sky had ever produced with an indifference so complete it bordered on something almost like patience. Her horses stood quietly at their anchor points, occasionally flicking their ears at sounds that reached them faintly from outside. Not panicking, not pressing against their tethers, simply standing in the dim lantern light with the unhurried ease of animals who sensed no immediate threat in the air around them. Her cows were chewing cud. Her sheep were sleeping in a loose pile near the rear wall, dry and warm against each other. Untroubled by a storm they could not properly hear from inside the stone. Clara checked the thermometer, wrote the number in her ledger, fed the animals. Their measured portions, checked the water, still liquid, still not frozen, still requiring no second trip and no broken ice, and walked back out into the storm to cover the 1/4 mile back to her cabin. The cold hit her like a physical thing when she stepped through the outer door. The difference between the cave's interior and the air outside it was 73 degrees. She stood in that threshold for one moment, 1 foot in the warmth and 1 foot in the killing cold. And she understood something about what she had built that no measurement in her ledger had quite captured until that moment. She had not built a barn. She had borrowed something that already existed, something that had been holding its temperature through Montana winters since before this land had a name, and she had asked it simply and directly to do for her animals what it had always done for itself. And it was doing it. She walked home through the storm, with that knowledge sitting in her chest, like the warmth she had just left behind, and she slept that night with more certainty than she had felt since the morning she first stood inside the cave during the hailstorm of October 1881 and felt the air go still around her. On the morning of January 13th, the storm broke. The wind dropped into an exhausted silence. The valley emerged from beneath it white and scoured and brittle-crusted with ice that caught the weak winter sun in sharp, unforgiving glints. Smoke rose from chimneys scattered across the basin in thin, anxious columns, evidence of homesteads burning through whatever fuel remained to them after 4 days of the worst cold. Anyone in the county could remember burning through it in a final effort to keep their families alive through the aftermath of what the storm had left behind. Clara walked the 1/4 mile to the cave on the morning of the 13th, with her boots crunching through drifts that came up past her knees in places, and she pushed through the double doors and stood in the interior and read the thermometer. 43 degrees. She wrote it in her ledger. Her hand trembled slightly. Not from cold. She stood at the cave entrance for a long time that morning, looking out across the frozen valley. She allowed herself for the first time since Edmund's death 14 months earlier a feeling she would later struggle to name precisely. Not triumph. The men who had mocked her had not yet seen what she had just witnessed with her own eyes, and triumph without witness is a private thing with no weight to it. Not relief either, because relief implied the danger had passed, and she understood that winter still held months left to test her. It was something quieter than either of those, closer to the particular certainty of a person who has just watched a private theory survive contact with the worst the world could throw at it, with no one yet to tell. She was still standing at the entrance, still holding that unnamed feeling, when she heard hoofbeats on the frozen ground. Ruth Calloway came around the edge of the limestone ridge on a horse that was blowing hard from being pushed too fast across difficult ground, and she pulled up at the cave mouth with an expression that Clara had not seen on anyone's face since this whole thing began. Not skepticism, not concern dressed up as concern. Something rawer than either. Ruth's losses from the storm were sitting in her saddlebag like stones she could not put down. 3 chickens, a milk goat, both gone, despite every blanket Silas had nailed across the coop. Despite every effort they had made through 4 days of cold that had simply overwhelmed the structures it was asked to spare. Ruth had spent the worst nights pressed against her children in the dark, listening to the wind try the walls of her house, the way a hungry animal tries a fence. And she had ridden out to Clara's homestead on the morning the storm broke, expecting, despite everything she had half suspected through the autumn, to find disaster waiting in that limestone hollow. She dismounted without quite deciding to, walked to the threshold, looked inside. Clara's animals stood calm in the dim winter light, breath rising soft and unhurried from their nostrils, the way breath rises from animals that are not cold, not frightened, not spending everything they have just to keep themselves alive. Ruth stood at the entrance for a long moment before the question came out. "Clara, how warm is it in there?" 43, Clara said. "The coldest it dropped all winter was 41. That was 2 weeks ago during the first hard cold snap." Ruth stepped inside. The air settled around her cooler than her own kitchen, but nowhere near the violence she had braced herself for. Dry. The hay smelled fresh rather than mildewy, a detail that struck her harder than the temperature itself, because every barn she had ever known carried at least a trace of damp rot by midwinter, an odor so constant she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing things that never go away. She looked at the animals, then at the thermometer, then at Clara. "How much feed are you going through?" Clara pulled the ledger from the shelf carved into the stone. 12 pounds of hay per head per day. My horses are holding their full weight. The cows are still producing milk." A pause. "I haven't lost a single animal since I moved them in." Ruth did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way a woman who has spent a decade managing a household budget cannot help doing when numbers are placed in front of her. Her own barn animals had been consuming 18 to 20 pounds a day just to maintain body heat against the cold. A third, more feed for stock that by any honest measure looked considerably worse off than Clara's. "What about water?" "Once a day, 43 degrees stays liquid. No second trip, no broken ice." Ruth stood in the strange stillness of the cave interior for a long moment. The storm sounds outside were already beginning to diminish as the wind finished dying, and in the quiet that followed, she could hear nothing but the slow breathing of animals at rest and the faint creak of the outer door moving in the last of the wind. She looked at Clara. Something moved across her face, a complicated thing made of several emotions that did not easily share the same expression. Shame was part of it. Awe was part of it. And underneath both of those, something that might have been, if it had been given more time to settle into itself, the beginning of genuine understanding. "You need to tell people about this," Ruth said finally. Clara looked at her evenly. "People already know," she said. "They just haven't decided to believe it yet." Ruth mounted her horse and rode back the way she had come. Clara watched her go, then turned back to the cave and the animals inside it and the thermometer that still read 43 degrees, while the smoke from every other homestead in the basin climbed thin and desperate against the cold blue morning sky. The aftermath of the January storm moved through Beaverhead County the way the storm itself had moved with a force that rearranged things. The losses were the worst in a decade. Ranchers who had never lost more than a handful of animals in a single winter found themselves tallying numbers that represented not just financial damage, but the accumulated failure of every preparation they had made, every confidence they had carried into the season. Walter Crane walked his property at dawn each morning for a week after the storm broke, counting what remained, calculating what the losses meant for the spring and the summer and the year beyond. He had built his reputation in Beaverhead County on 12 years of hard-won judgment, and judgment, once spoken aloud in front of witnesses, did not bend easily, even when the evidence directly in front of a man's eyes suggested it should. He did not go to Clara's cave that week, but the conversation in the county had already begun to shift, not dramatically, not yet, and not in the direction of anything that resembled admiration. More like a low, uneasy current moving beneath the surface of the usual talk, the sound of men trying to reconcile what they had predicted with what they were beginning to suspect they might have been wrong about. A man would mention almost in passing over coffee at the general store that the Widow Holt stock looked fat for the season. Another would note that her chimney smoked thin and intermittent against the thick columns rising from every other homestead, suggested she was burning almost no firewood for her animals through the worst weather the territory had thrown at anyone in a decade. Neither man would say what the observation implied, but both men heard it. Samuel Pratt heard it. He had built 40 barns in 15 years, and he had told Clara to her face in the summer that her cave would sweat itself into uselessness by January. He rode out alone on a gray morning in the last week of January, carrying a small moisture meter he had built himself years earlier from a design in a builder's pamphlet out of Chicago. And he spent nearly 2 hours inside the cave, working through it, systematically running his palm along the limestone walls at different heights, checking the hay stacked near the entrance against the hay stored deeper toward the rear, measuring condensation at the ceiling, near the ventilation shafts where he had been absolutely certain that moisture would pull and freeze and bring the whole structure toward eventual failure. He found almost nothing. A faint dampness near the outer door, where warm interior air met the coldest edge of the entrance. Nothing beyond what any structure breathing warm air into cold would naturally produce. Nothing approaching the catastrophic wet decay he had predicted with the full authority of 30 years of building experience. He sat on an overturned feed bin near the animal enclosure for a long while after his measurements were finished, saying nothing, his jaw working the way a man's jaw works when he is chewing on something considerably harder than food. Clara watched him from across the cave without speaking. She had learned that some moments required space rather than conversation, and this was clearly one of them. When Samuel Pratt finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. Stripped of the professional certainty that had carried it when he stood at this same entrance 6 months earlier and delivered his confident verdict. "I have built 40 barns in this territory," he said. "Not one of them would have performed like this through what just passed." He paused. "You weren't guessing when you built this. You were engineering something I didn't have the eyes to see." Clara said nothing beyond a small nod. She had learned across 18 months of solitary labor that some admissions did not require a response, only the dignity of being allowed to stand on their own. She gave him that. Pratt left without another word, carrying his moisture meter and his notebook, and something considerably heavier than either the particular weight of a man who has staked his professional reputation on a prediction and watched the evidence quietly, methodically, and without drama prove him wrong. He would be back, she knew, with measuring tape and drafting paper, with questions he had not yet formulated, with the careful, slightly obsessive thoroughness of a builder who had discovered a structural principle he did not yet fully understand and could not rest until he did. She was right about that, but that was still ahead. For now, the cave held its 43 degrees through the last days of January and into February, patient and consistent, and entirely indifferent to the argument that had raged around it for the better part of a year. Outside, the valley was still tallying its losses. Inside, Clara Holt's animals were eating measured portions of hay and drinking liquid water and breathing air that moved at the correct rate through the ventilation shafts she had re-angled in November, pulling fresh air in and warm, stale air out in the slow, steady rhythm she had designed for them. The rhythm of the cave itself, unhurried, consistent, asking nothing of the animals sheltered within it, except that they stand still and breathe. And somewhere in the stone above her head, 20 feet of limestone held its ancient temperature against the worst winter Beaverhead County had seen in a decade, indifferent to the cold pressing against it from outside, indifferent to the mockery and the doubt and the plain-spoken certainty of men who had not believed it could do what it was doing. It had never needed anyone to believe in it. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to ask. Samuel Pratt came back on a Tuesday. Clara knew he would. She had seen it in the way he left, not with the finality of a man who had said what he came to say and was done with the subject, but with the particular restlessness of a builder who had encountered a problem he could not yet fully solve in his own mind. He came back with drafting paper rolled under his arm and a measuring tape coiled at his belt, and the careful, slightly embarrassed efficiency of a man who intended to make his presence about the work rather than about what the work meant for everything he had believed before he saw it. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the cave entrance on a gray February morning, nodded once at Clara, and began measuring. She let him work without interruption. She went about her own tasks, feeding the animals their morning portions, checking the water, reading the thermometer, and recording the number in her ledger, while Pratt moved through the cave with his tape and his drafting pencil, marking dimensions on paper, with the obsessive thoroughness of a man who had decided that if he was going to understand this thing, he was going to understand it completely. He measured the entrance width. He measured the height of the stone barrier just inside the threshold. He measured the angle of the drainage trench by running a level along its length and recording the grade. He pressed his palm flat against the limestone walls at different points and held it there, feeling for moisture, finding almost none. He checked the ventilation shafts with a candle held near the openings, watching the flame bend consistently upward, regardless of the wind direction outside. He examined the hay stacked at the rear of the cave, pulling handfuls from different depths and pressing them between his fingers, checking for the dampness that should have been there, according to everything he knew about enclosed spaces and condensation and the behavior of organic material in cold air. The hay was dry, all of it, even the bales pressed against the limestone walls. He worked for 2 hours without speaking. Clara worked alongside him in silence, and the only sounds in the cave were the quiet movements of the animals and the scratch of Pratt's pencil on paper, and the occasional distant suggestion of wind from somewhere above the ridge. When he finally finished, he sat down on the overturned feed bin he had occupied during his first visit and looked at his drawings for a long time. Then he looked up at Clara. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer makes me look worse than I already do." Clara waited. "The ventilation shafts," Pratt said. "Did you get them right the first time?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she sat down across from him on a hay bale and told him about the November morning when she had woken before dawn and smelled air that was not moving correctly. She told him about the 4 days she had spent reopening the second shaft and re-angling it until the candle flame bent consistently upward, no matter what the wind did outside. She told him about the 3 or 4 degrees of error that had made the difference between a shaft that worked and one that looked like it worked, while quietly failing every time the wind shifted to the northwest. She told him the thing she had not told anyone, the thing she had been carrying alone since November, because admitting it had felt, even after everything else, like handing a weapon to people who were still looking for reasons to dismiss what she had built. Pratt listened without interrupting. His pencil moved steadily as she spoke, marking corrections on his drawings. When she finished, he looked up at her with an expression that held none of the condescension she had prepared herself to deflect. "You corrected your own mistake before it caused harm," he said, "without anyone watching, without anyone knowing it needed to be done." He paused. "That's worth more to me than if you'd gotten it right the first time. A man who gets something right by accident doesn't understand it well enough to tell anyone else how to do it. A man who finds his own error and fixes it understands it all the way through." He went back to his drawings. Clara went back to her animals. Neither of them said anything more about it for the rest of that morning. What Pratt produced from those 2 hours of measurement drawings he would eventually copy by hand and distribute to anyone who asked careful diagrams, marking the angle of the ventilation shafts, the grade of the drainage trench, the precise height of the low stone barrier at the entrance would become the technical foundation for every cave stable built in Beaverhead County in the years that followed. The specifications were thorough, precise, and grounded in every detail in what Clara had built and tested and corrected across 8 months of solitary work. They did not credit her by name. Clara noticed this when Pratt showed her the finished drawings the following week, asking her to check them for errors before he distributed them. She read through the specifications carefully corrected. One detail, the angle of the second ventilation shaft, which Pratt had marked at 30 degrees when the correct angle was 33, and handed the papers back to him without commenting on the omission. Ruth Calloway, who was present for that exchange, noticed it too. She said nothing while Pratt was there. After he left, riding back toward Dylan with his drawings tucked under his arm, Ruth looked at Clara with an expression that mixed indignation with something more complicated. He's not going to put your name on it, Ruth said. Not a question. No, Clara agreed. That isn't right. Clara considered this for a moment. She was standing at the cave entrance with the February light coming thin and cold across the valley. And she was thinking about Edmund and the wall and the $40 she had spent on hinges and canvas, and the 4 months she had spent turning a hole in a rock into something that worked. I didn't build it to have my name on it, she said finally. I built it because 3 sheep and a calf died the winter before, and I wasn't willing to let that happen again. She paused. The specifications are correct. That's what matters. The next person who builds one of these won't have to learn every lesson the hard way. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You're more generous than I would be. I'm more tired than generous, Clara said. There's a difference. The night of February 3rd arrived without warning, in the way that real emergencies always arrive, not gradually, not with sufficient time to prepare, but suddenly and completely demanding everything at once. Clara woke at midnight to a sound she recognized before she was fully conscious. A low, sustained distress call from the cave, audible even through the cabin walls and the quarter-mile of frozen ground between them. Not the restless pawing she had heard in December. Something with more urgency in it. Something that was asking for something. She was dressed and moving through the dark before the sound had fully registered as what it was. The pregnant cow had gone into labor 6 weeks early. Clara came through the double doors with her lantern already lit and found the animal in active distress, sides heaving, legs shifting with the particular agitation of a body doing something it was being forced to do before it was ready. She ran her hands along the cow's flank and felt what she felt, and her heart dropped the way it drops when you recognize a problem you have seen before and remember how it ended the last time. The calf was positioned wrong. One front leg folded back instead of extended forward. A malpresentation, the kind that would stall the birth entirely if it was not corrected, the kind that could kill the calf before it arrived, and the mother shortly after if the situation was left unaddressed. Clara had seen this once before, years earlier, watching her mother work alongside a hired hand on a farm in Iowa. The memory was thin and specific. The smell of the barn the lamp held at a particular angle. The way the hired hand's arm had disappeared into the birth canal up to his shoulder, while her mother counted contractions. She had been 12 years old. She had not thought about that night in decades. She thought about it now. The cave held 44 degrees. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but warm enough, crucially, essentially warm enough, that she was not also fighting cold on top of everything else. Her hands were cold when she stripped off her gloves, but they were cold the way hands are cold in a chilly room, not the way hands are cold when they have been exposed to killing air. The difference between those two kinds of cold was the difference between functional and failing, and in the next 2 hours she was going to need her hands to work. She spoke to the cow in a low, steady voice. Not words exactly, just sound, the particular register that livestock respond to, as meaning that the person beside them is present and not panicking that the situation is being handled, that the correct thing to do is to trust and be still. The cow's eyes were wild, but her legs had stopped their frantic shifting. Animals Clara had learned took their emotional cues from the people around them with a fidelity that was almost alarming. She could not afford to be frightened. So she was not frightened. She reached into the birth canal and found the folded leg. What followed was 2 hours of work that she would never describe in detail to anyone who had not done it, because the details required a context that most people did not have, and that she did not have the patience to provide. She worked by lantern light, her arm in past her wrist, and then past her elbow, feeling for the angle of the leg, trying to understand in the dark, by touch alone, what she could not see, trying to move something that did not want to move against the pressure of contractions that came whether she was ready for them or not. Halfway through, exhausted, in a way that went past her muscles and into something deeper, she said aloud to no one, to the stone walls, to the lantern, to the darkness at the rear of the cave, where her sleeping sheep were the only witnesses. Words that came out cracked and without ceremony. I cannot lose this one too. I cannot. The leg came forward just past 2 a.m. The calf followed within minutes, slick and shaking small, beyond what the calendar should have allowed its body, steaming faintly in the cave's mild air. Clara sat back against the limestone wall and watched the cow turn to lick her calf clean, with the unhurried certainty of an animal who had never registered the crisis that had just consumed the last 2 hours of another creature's life on her behalf. The calf breathed. It blinked. It moved its legs against the stone floor with the instinctive urgency of a body that did not know it had arrived before it was supposed to. Clara sat with her back against the cold stone and her arms trembling and her hands raw beyond feeling, and she looked at the animal that was alive, because the cave had been warm enough to work in at 2 a.m. in a Montana February. And she thought about Edmund's barn, about the temperature inside it on a night like this one, about what the outcome would have been if she had been working in a timber frame structure where the cold came through every gap and the breath of the laboring animal hung in frozen clouds, and her hands had been too numb to feel what they were doing. She knew what the outcome would have been. She had seen it at other homesteads. She had heard about it from women who did not talk about it directly, but whose eyes said what their voices would not when the subject came near. The cave had given her the one thing no timber barn in the county could have given her on a night like this. It had taken the cold off the table. It had reduced the number of things that could go wrong from every possible thing to only the things that were happening, and that reduction, that single quiet subtraction, had made the difference between a crisis she could manage and one she could not. She stayed with the cow and the calf until dawn, too wrung out to walk back to the cabin, too unwilling to leave them alone in the first hours when anything might still go wrong. She sat with her back against the limestone and watched the calf grow steadier on its legs, and watched the cow's breathing slow from exertion back towards something that looked like ordinary evening. And somewhere in those early morning hours, she slept sitting up against the stone without meaning to. When she recorded the night in her ledger the next morning, her handwriting was looser than usual. The entry covered 4 lines instead of the usual 2. She allowed herself 1 line beyond the bare facts. The cave held steady through everything I could not control. She told Ruth about that night 2 weeks later, not because she had decided to share it, but because Ruth asked a direct question, and Clara had never been able to manage indirect answers to direct questions. Ruth went very still when Clara finished. "You did that alone," Ruth said. Not quite a question. "I didn't have anyone else," Clara said. And there was no self-pity in the words, only the plain accounting of a fact she had long since stopped fighting because fighting it cost more than she could afford to spend. Ruth reached out and took her hand. The gesture was unpracticed between them, but entirely sincere. Walter Crane came to the cave in the middle of February. He came alone, which Clara had not expected. She had assumed, if he came at all, that he would come with witnesses, the way he had come before, with the performance of certainty that an audience required. Instead, he arrived on a quiet weekday morning with a thermometer strapped to his saddlebag and a notebook he had purchased specifically for the visit, and he dismounted without speaking and looked at Clara, and then looked at the cave entrance, and then looked back at Clara with something in his expression that she had not seen there before. Not hostility, not the compressed certainty he had carried like a tool through every previous exchange. Something more provisional than that. Something that had been worked on by the winter and by 11 dead cattle and by 4 days of a blizzard that had done to his herd what it had not done to hers. She led him in without a word. He walked the full length of the cave. He checked the ventilation shafts with his own candle, watching the flame bend upward. He knelt at the drainage trench and ran his fingers along the grade. He stood in the animal enclosure for several long minutes, simply watching the livestock move and breathe and eat the early calf among them, now 3 weeks old, small but vigorous nursing, with the healthy appetite of an animal that had not read the calendar and did not know it had arrived before its time. He hung his own thermometer beside Clara's near the entrance. Both read 45 degrees. Outside, the air carried 8 degrees. The kind of cold that would have driven any sensible man indoors within minutes. Walter opened his notebook. "How much hay since November?" he asked. His voice carried none of the certainty it had carried on that November morning. Something closer to careful neutrality, the tone of a man trying not to reveal how much the question cost him. 870 pounds total as of this morning, Clara said. 2 horses, 4 cows, 9 sheep, and the calf. Walter worked the numbers on paper. His pencil moved slowly. "Standard barn," he said finally, his voice flat with calculation rather than judgment. "That same number of animals would have gone through over 1,400 pounds by now, and half of them would likely be dead or dying given what this winter has done to every other herd in the county." "Water," Clara said. "1 trip a day, 30 gallons. It doesn't freeze. Feed costs 40% less than last winter." She kept her voice in the same register she had used for everything since November, steady, factual, the voice of someone reading numbers off a page. No losses to freezing, no losses to spoilage, no losses to illness. Walter looked at her for a long moment. Something worked behind his eyes that looked almost like pain before it settled into something quieter. "Your animals are healthier than mine," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "You have burned no firewood for this stable." The earth does the work, she said. It always has. We just never asked it to. Walter closed his notebook slowly. He stood in the cave interior, with the thermometer behind him reading 45 degrees and 11 dead cattle, somewhere in the accounting of his conscience, and his jaw tightened once, before the words came stripped of every defense he had carried into this valley since the day he first stood at this entrance and told her she was going to kill everything she owned. I told you this was dangerous, he said. His voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. You did, Clara said. I was wrong. Clara nodded once. She offered him nothing more than that. No elaboration, no recrimination, no carefully banked satisfaction at finally hearing it said directly. She understood, watching him stand there, with his notebook full of numbers that contradicted everything he had believed, that the admission had cost him something he could not easily name, and that forcing him to say more would only make the cost harder to bear. But Walter Crane did not leave. He stood for a moment longer in the cave interior, and then he did something Clara had not anticipated. He set his notebook down on the feed bin where Pratt had sat 3 weeks earlier, and he looked at her with an expression that had moved past the arithmetic and into somewhere more personal. There is something I need to tell you, he said. I should have told you before. I did not, and I want you to understand why, because without it, my behavior toward you this past year does not make the sense it should. Clara waited. My younger brother, Walter said. His voice had dropped to something she had to be still to hear properly. Bobby, 3 years ago in the Bitterroot country in Idaho, he was caught out in a sudden storm while checking fence line on a mining claim, caught out the way any man gets caught in mountain weather when the sky changes its mind without enough warning to do anything useful about it. He stopped, started again. He found a mining cut in the rock face, deep enough to block the wind dry inside the obvious choice for a man who knows enough to get out of the weather and wait it out. He crawled in and he went to sleep. The cave was very quiet. The snow loaded on the rock above the entrance through the night. The roof came in while he was sleeping. By the time the storm cleared enough to let us through to him, Walter stopped again. His jaw worked. It took me 3 days of digging to reach him. Clara said nothing. She let the words stand in the air between them because they needed to stand there before anything else could be said. I fought what you were building, Walter said. Not because I thought you were wrong as a woman doing a man's work. I fought it because every time I looked at that entrance, I saw the entrance Bobby crawled into, and I could not separate what you were building from what the earth did to him. I know that is not your fault. I know that is not a fair reason to have done what I did, but I wanted you to know it was the reason. Clara was quiet for a long moment. The cow shifted her weight somewhere behind them. The calf moved toward its mother with the small, determined steps of a very young animal learning the distance between need and source. The stone took your brother because of weight and bad luck and an entrance that wasn't built to hold what came down on it. Clara said, her voice gentle in the way that truth delivered carefully can be gentle without being soft. Not because the earth turned against him, not because stone is treacherous. She paused. I am sorry that happened to you. I am sorry it happened to Bobby. But I cannot carry the guilt of it any more than I can carry the guilt of every barn that failed every winter for 20 years before I ever picked up a pickaxe. Walter looked at her for a long time. I know that, he said. I think some part of me always did. I just needed a winter cold enough to burn the rest of it out of me. He picked up his notebook. He put on his hat. He walked to the cave entrance and stopped there with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the frozen valley before he turned once more. I'll tell them, he said. At the next community meeting, I'll tell them in front of everyone. Then he mounted his horse and rode back down the ridge, and Clara stood at the cave entrance and watched him go, and felt something settle in her chest that was not triumph, and was not relief, and was not forgiveness exactly, though it contained something of all three. It was more like completion, the closing of a circle that had been open since the morning she found Edmund against the splintered wall. The county meeting was held in the back room of the Dillon General Store on the second Thursday of March, called ostensibly to discuss spring planting schedules. Everyone who attended understood within 5 minutes that the meeting had a different center of gravity than its stated purpose. Walter Crane stood before 24 ranchers, men who had known him for years. Men who had taken his word as a reliable measure of what was true about this land and this work. And he said what he had come to say without preamble. I was wrong about Clara Holt's cave stable. I have checked the setup with my own hands, and I have run the numbers myself. It performs better than anything the rest of us are doing, by every measure that matters. Feed consumption, water, efficiency, animal survival, structural integrity, through the worst weather this county has seen in a decade. We would be fools not to learn from it before next winter takes more of our stock than this one already has. Samuel Pratt stood near the back, arms crossed, nodding slowly, his own reversal already common knowledge by then. His drawings already making their way through the county in copied form. Harlan Dunbar sat near the front hat in his lap, saying nothing. His silence was its own kind of statement. The murmur that moved through the room afterward was not quite agreement and not quite resistance. It was the sound of men recalibrating something they had held as settled fact for longer than most of them could remember the particular audible quality of certainty losing its footing. Clara was not present. She had not been invited, and she would not have attended even if she had been, because she understood with the same clear-eyed practicality that had carried her through every other test that winter, that her presence in that room would have turned the conversation into performance rather than substance. The men in that room needed to reach their own conclusions in their own time, without the complication of her being there to make it feel like defeat rather than sense. Ruth came to the cave the following afternoon with the story still bright on her face. He said it in front of everyone, Ruth said, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. Walter Crane in front of 24 men said he was wrong. Clara absorbed this standing at the cave entrance with her hands still raw from the morning's work, and she felt the thing she had been waiting for settle into its final shape. Not vindication, that word implied she had needed someone else's acknowledgement to know she had been right, and she had not. She had known since January 13th, when she read 43 degrees on the thermometer after 4 days of the worst storm in a decade. What she felt was simpler than vindication. Quieter. More like the particular exhaustion of an argument finally ending. An argument she had been conducting not in words, but in numbers carved patiently into a ledger through the coldest winter in recent memory, and that had finally reached the only conclusion she had ever cared about. "It doesn't change what the winter cost me," she said after a moment. Her voice was quieter than Ruth had expected. "Edmund is still gone. That first winter still happened the way it happened." Ruth reached out and took her hand again, easier this time, more practiced the gesture of a friendship that had stopped needing to announce itself. "No," Ruth said, "but it means nobody can tell you anymore that you didn't know what you were doing." April came, the way it always came to Beaverhead County, reluctantly, in stages, the cold releasing its grip on the valley floor. The way something releases what it has been holding for a very long time, with a kind of slow, stiff uncertainty that made the first warm days feel almost provisional. On a morning in the first week of April, Clara opened the double doors of the cave and stood aside. Her horses walked out first into pale spring sunlight, their coats thick and clean, their weight held exactly as it had been in November when they walked in. The gray mare Patience paused at the threshold, the way she had paused when she first entered 5 months earlier, evaluating, deciding, and then stepped forward into the open air with the unhurried dignity of an animal that had never been rushed into anything. The cows followed their sides heavy with the calves of the coming spring. The early calf, the one Clara had pulled by lantern light with her arms past her wrists on a February morning, while the cave held 44 degrees and gave her the only thing it was able to give, which was enough, walked out on steady legs, blinking in the stronger light, already more animal than miracle. The sheep came last, thick-coated and clean, in a way that drew comment from neighbors who had ridden over to watch, and who stood at a respectful distance observing an emergence they had spent the autumn predicting would never happen. Nobody said anything for a while. The animals grazed on the season's first new grass along the base of the limestone ridge, and the neighbors stood and watched them. And the silence had in it something that went beyond the ordinary quiet of a spring morning. Across the rest of the county, the same neighbors had spent that week counting their dead, tallying losses in ledgers that pointed in the same direction they had always pointed, trying to find words to explain to their families why this winter had cost them so much more than it should have, why the method they had trusted had failed them, as it had always failed them, while they called the failure the cost of the land rather than the cost of the method. Clara stood at the cave entrance and watched her animals move into the morning, and she let herself feel fully and without reservation the thing she had been holding at arm's length since January. She had been right, not the small right of a person who wins an argument, the larger right of a person who builds something true when everyone around them is certain it is false, and then stands beside it through the coldest winter in a decade, while it proves itself without apology or drama, or any assistance beyond the patience of the earth itself. She thought about Edmund, not the way she had thought about him through the dark months with grief and with guilt, and with the weight of the question she could never answer about what would have happened if she had walked out into the storm that night instead of staying inside. She thought about him differently now, with something that had finally, after 16 months, separated itself from the grief and become its own clear thing. Edmund had believed in what could be seen. The square barn, the stacked wood, the visible proof of effort. He had died for that belief on a night when the visible proof was not enough, had never been enough, had never been designed to be enough against a cold that did not care what a structure looked like from the road. Clara had built something no one could see from the road. Something that did not look from the outside like anything more than a hole in a rock. Something that required a person to step inside and stand still and feel the air around them before they could understand what they were standing in. She had built it alone in the months after Edmund's death, using his tools and her own reasoning, and the memory of 20 minutes inside a cave during a hailstorm. And she had watched it survive everything. The worst Montana winter in a decade had thrown against it with the same patient indifference that the stone itself brought to every storm that had ever crossed this valley. The earth had not asked for her belief. It had not required her confidence or her certainty or anyone's approval. It had simply held its temperature the way it had held it for 10,000 years before she arrived, waiting for someone desperate enough and observant enough and stubborn enough to finally stop arguing with it and ask it directly and simply for help. It had given her what she asked for. It had given her animals that walked out of a Montana winter healthier than they walked in. It had given her a calf that should not have survived the night it was born, and was now grazing in April sunlight on legs that grew steadier with each passing day. It had given her the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who has built something true and stood beside it through every test the world could produce and watched it hold. Everett Alcott, the youngest rancher in the county at 29, rode over that morning and stood beside Clara at the cave entrance with his hat in his hands and his notebook already open, asking questions about ventilation angles and drainage grades with the direct practical urgency of a man who was already calculating how to apply what he was seeing to the rock formation on his own property before next November arrived. Clara answered every question he brought her, walking him through the design point by point. The height of the stone barrier, the angle of the shafts she had reworked after her November failure, the grade of the drainage trench she had tested with buckets of water before committing a single chisel stroke to the stone. She did not withhold the details of her mistakes. She understood watching Alcott write with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely trying to learn, rather than simply trying to copy, that her failures were as valuable to him as her successes. A man who knew where the design could fail was a man far less likely to repeat the failure himself. That was the thing about knowledge honestly given. It grew rather than diminished. It traveled further than any single person could carry it. It arrived eventually in places its origin could not have imagined. Ruth came and stood beside her as Alcott rode back toward his property with his notebook full of measurements and his mind already working the problem. The two women stood together at the cave entrance in the April morning. looking out at the valley where the season was just beginning its long, slow return from what the winter had taken. And neither of them spoke for a while, because some moments do not require speech to be understood by the people standing inside them. Clara pulled her coat tighter against the last of the morning chill. The limestone ridge rose behind her patient, and unhurried, holding its ancient temperature in the dark interior, as it had held it through every season since before anyone had thought to give this valley a name. It would hold it through the summer that was coming, and through the winter that would follow that summer, and through every season after that, in the long, indifferent patience of stone that has never needed anything from the people who lived in its shadow. It had only needed once someone willing to stop arguing with it long enough to listen. The earth does not forget what it knows. It simply waits for the right question.